You all okay? Good. Some of you not so okay? Yeah, too. Before I start, I'd first of all just like to say how incredible I thought Jenny Byrne was last week. I think it's right to acknowledge. It's quite interesting. Ant spoke a couple of weeks ago on a Wednesday night. I don't know whether you remember. He'd read something at the end of one of the meetings. And he talked about understanding of how sometimes things just all seem to fit into place. And he said that this guy had written it, he called it the thin place, where all of a sudden you get into this strand where for some reason, and without, some people would say, oh, well, it's God. Well, you don't, just something happens, everything, all the dynamics seem to add up and come into the right place. And I really believe that last week you were kind of experiencing that thin place. What she said and what she brought and what she delivered couldn't have come at a more fitting time, a more appropriate time to what was going on in the present moment. And I think that God is definitely speaking in lots of different ways. You know, we've heard in the past that, you know, we had it so bound of how God works. And yet I believe that God speaks in so many different ways. And I really hope that last week, what Jenny brought to you really did spark off a new enthusiasm towards building the dream. Because at the end of the day, we're building something quite spectacular here, and you are part of it. This isn't just about the Chapman family or about the staff or about this close-knit group of people. You are part of building this dream. So be inspired by that, because you are part of what, it's not just here, it's ultimately about what we're sending out far and wide all across the globe. I know Anth is he in Austin at the minute? He's been in Australia and is now in Austin, really speaking some amazing truths from the new covenant to them, and they absolutely drink it up. You know, sometimes I think we can forget how lucky we are to have such amazing teaching, so it's great that we can send him out there. So you'll just have to put up with me tonight, if that's okay. Right, let me start with this. It seemed to me certain, and I still think so today, that one can never wrestle enough with God if one does so out of a pure regard for truth. I'm just going to read it one more time. It seemed to me certain, and I still think so today, that one can never wrestle enough with God if one does so out of pure regard for truth. How many of you would agree that some of the institutionalized church have kind of presented a bit of a package to people that the more faith that you have, ultimately the more you will receive? And to some degree, when I was younger, even kind of when I was being brought up, that was kind of similar to how I viewed faith, that by the level of your faith you would be rewarded, and ultimately if things weren't happening just quite how you wanted them to be happening, ultimately, it was a question of you not having the right level of faith. Now, when you think about it now, so what is the correct level of faith? I mean, it gets all very complicated, doesn't it? Yeah, you know, and that's a whole preach in itself, but, you know, be thinking about that. I've seen some things recently that inspired me to deliver what I'm going to deliver tonight, and it was this. Increase your faith if you want big promises. If you don't pray bold prayers in faith, you can't expect bold results. God is waiting to do amazing things in your life if you will just have faith. Now, I don't know about you, but that makes this quite complicated, doesn't it? Because how do you box up then what that faith looks like in order to receive what ultimately they are actually selling to you? It becomes almost like you pay this, and then this is what then is delivered. Now, we've learned if it's not good and it's not news, and it's not something that everybody can be included in, and it's all complicated and there's lots of small print, then it's not really something that we want to be part of, is it? And like Jenny said last week, if it gets too complicated, there's really no point in being here, because our message is supposed to be so far and wide to every single person. It shouldn't be a message that complicates things to the point at which people are like, you know, what is this about? Now, would you agree that all of us like to feel certain? I would say sometimes I would prefer for there to be a small print that says, if you do this, like if you know, heading faith, this is what is required in your faith ultimately to get these rewards. It would actually be sometimes a little bit easier because you'd know then what boxes you had to tick. Unfortunately, that's just not how it works. And also, when you actually read scripture and look in the Bible, what the church has somehow morphed faith into being, it's a very different story when you read. Now, some of you may have never, ever even read the Bible. Now, that doesn't mean I'm going to send you away and read it, because sometimes I don't know whether that's a great idea either. Another thing you need to remember, the Bible was intended to be read together in groups and talked about. So if you're ever reading, get someone to read it with and ask questions. There's nothing wrong with that. So what I want to do to start with is present why a certainty-seeking type of faith can get so messy and why it can ultimately cause so many problems. So let me show you number one. Certainty-seeking faith is more about doing and believing certain things in order to gain God's favor, manipulating God to benefit ourselves and others. You might find that when I'm reading these, some of them ring true in your head. Number two, next one. It's like we buy into a package deal to feel loved, accepted, and secure. We cannot afford to think flexibly and therefore left with a faith that's brittle and easily broken. Next one. Having to feel certain all the time creates a learning phobia that leads to an immature community of people unable to objectively reflect and debate their beliefs. Anybody with me on that? Anybody heard the word pseudo-community? I've spoken on it before. Pseudo-community is basically where everybody makes sure that their beliefs are all lined up, even if they don't believe what they believe. That's not the point. Everything has to be uniformed as to make sure the camp stays pretty and in form. We've read the, what's on the website, the Pioneer and Settler. Pseudo-community is very much a settler mentality. It's let's make sure everything is kept nice. Right, so let's look at the next one. Feeling secure and having a concern for truth don't really go together. A concern for truth requires us to challenge whether beliefs we hold are mistaken. Not much certainty in that, is there? Really? Now, if that was what we were selling, it's quite hard to sell that as easy as it is if you just have a good faith. God will just give you everything that you require. If you start reading that to some degree, well, why would I connect to that then? Some people say the whole point of religion is, well, give me something. When I'm going to challenge tonight, it's not that I need to give you anything, because what has already happened is enough, and I'm going to try and get you to that place. All right. Now, we're often taught that our closeness to God is about having the right beliefs. This couldn't be further from the truth. The Pharisees believed that they had everything in the right place. They believed everything. Did the Pharisees tick all the boxes? You all right, Jamie, mate? You okay? No, you okay? Yeah. Good one, mate. We'll chat afterwards, all right? I know you are, mate. Just checking you're all right. We'll chat afterwards, all right? Right, so we're told that our closeness to God is on the basis of our right beliefs. Now, the Pharisees believed that they had everything in the right place, ultimately making them feel that they had it all right. Now, the problem with that was Jesus then confronted their version of what they believed. Now, that really did create quite a stink, didn't it? The Pharisees did not like the fact that someone came along and said, sorry, but everything that you're thinking is actually not what I'm trying to get across here. Let me put up the next slide. Listen to this. True faith is grounded in authenticity. It is never about striving for certainty, but about being faithful in the face of uncertainty. Let me read that again. True faith is grounded in authenticity. It's never about striving for certainty, but about being faithful in the face of uncertainty. So what are you not certain of in your life tonight? Chris said in the welcome, it's interesting, she really did kind of ask some of the questions that I wanted to ask. We've got Nonny, who's, got a battle on at the minute with what she's facing. We've got people who have got struggles with their kids. We've got people who've got struggles with their finances. We've got people who've got struggles with relationships. The fact is, when you're in that position, it leaves you feeling very unsure, doesn't it, and very vulnerable. Now, my question would be, is that feeling of unsureness, if that's even a word, and insecurity a bad thing? Or is it actually something that God maybe requires of us to have to prove that actually our faith can be made genuine? Now, I hope that any of you tonight who are going through a really tough struggle, the fact is all of us are facing stuff, but some of us particularly have very difficult things. I hope this tonight helps you perceive and see where you're at in a very different way. And actually, by the end, give you some sort of hope that there is an answer, even if it's not the answer sometimes we wish it was, if that makes sense. Now, if my answer to you on your struggles was to be, increase your faith, then we've got a problem already. Because if I tell you to increase your faith and that's what God says is going to be the thing that gets you the results, there's many people in here I know who have faced struggles, who I believe have got incredible faith, and yet when I look at the situation that they're in, it has never changed. For example, and I hope she doesn't mind, Betty Wright is one of my heroes. I hope you don't mind me mentioning you, Betty. She is, and Jenny Byrne would say she is one of my heroes, and when I look at the way she lives her life, to me, it's just totally phenomenal. She has had a situation in her life where she has stood massively by the word, believing, and the result hasn't always been, has it, quite what you were expecting it to be. Now, my issue is, if the story goes like this, the more faith you have, you'll get the rewards, then God's a liar. He's a cheat and he's a crook. And like Jenny says, let's all go home. Do you believe he's a liar and a crook? Because I don't. That's not the God I've met. But can you understand why people who haven't been connected to Christianity can start saying there's something not quite right here? Because if the answers and the rewards that we get are based on faith, the question is, there are a lot of people who have massive faith but never see the rewards, so God isn't upholding his side of the bargain if that's the truth. See, I don't believe it is the truth. I'm going to teach you tonight really what genuine, authentic faith is, and I'm hoping it's going to inspire you. So let's look a little bit then at some of the things in the Bible. For example, everything's not sort of sugar-coated in Scripture. There's a lot of fights, there's a lot of arguments, there's a lot of questions. I sometimes don't understand how the church has got to where it's got when they read Scripture, because to me, when I read it, to me now, through the eyes, it's like we've said, you can read it through the eyes of law or you can read it through the eyes of grace. And maybe it's just that I now read it through the eyes of grace. But to me, the whole thing makes perfect sense. And it's just a bunch of people who are battling through stuff, which is hope to me because we're all in exactly the same boat, aren't we? You've got Jeremiah. He complains to God about his unjust treatment of him and his people and asks why he lets the wicked get off scot-free. So here we have somebody posing quite a serious question to God. Lamentations, which was also written by Jeremiah, he says to God, "You have acted like a vicious predator." Are you allowed to say that? Habakkuk was a prophet. God, why do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up the righteous? I'm just throwing some of these things out because, sometimes we can hear all the pretty parts, can't we? These are prophets and speakers who were very much in line with the heart of God, who were actually at the same time questioning the very God that they said they served. Now, is that okay? Well, we'll have to see, won't we? Anyway, we've then got a guy called Jacob. Now, any of you heard the story of Jacob? Most of you will have done. So we've got Jacob, who basically, right from when he was conceived in the womb, he grabs the heel of his brother because he basically wants to get out first because he wants the inheritance. Because way back in those days, the firstborn was the person who basically would get all of the inheritance at the end. And he was like, no, I don't want to be second, I want to be first. Anyway, he doesn't get first, he gets second. So through a long list of events, he basically manages to manipulate the situation so he ends up with the birthright. You can read it. It's in Genesis 32 if you decide that you want to read it. It's a really good story. Now, you could say Jacob was a very determined man. He knew what he wanted, and he wanted to make sure that everything just worked out how he felt it should be. Some say he's ruthless, some say a con artist, some say a liar, a manipulator. Now, what's interesting, if you look at the name Jacob literally means grabber. Some people have said heel catcher, and it actually means grabber. Now, I'm going to explain why that has so much meaning in a second. So then we go on that Jacob is having to flee his brother because his brother's trying to kill him. He's upset his father. Everything's just kind of gone wrong for him. So everything that he thought would make him feel certain now isn't making him feel certain. So he's in a total mess. He flees where he lives with his family, with his livestock. He sends his family and his livestock over the river, and he stays in the wilderness by himself alone through the night. Now, what happens? Jacob then all of a sudden starts to wrestle with this dude in the middle of a wilderness. Don't know where he came from, but this dude shows up. And they start fighting all night. Now, the narrative says, when this guy saw that he could not overpower Jacob, he touched Jacob's hip socket and popped it out while he was wrestling with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." Now that's a bit odd, because it's like, daybreak, and what is a vampire or something? It's like, it's like the sun's rising quick, I've got to go, But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go until you bless me." Then the man says, "What is your name?" He says, "Jacob." Remember what Jacob meant? He answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled," listen, "with God and with humans and have overcome." So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, listen to this, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." So this guy that he's just had the wrestling match with, the narrative is telling us that was God himself, which is really quite incredible. The sun rose above him, and as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the limp later on, which I know that Anth has spoken about before. So all of a sudden, we've got this concept of someone in a fight with God. Just think about that for a second. Think about all that I said earlier about this certainty-seeking faith, and all of a sudden we've got a man wrestling through the whole night with God himself. Slightly different thing going on here. Could God have overpowered Jacob? It said, when the man saw that he could not overpower Jacob, he touched the socket of his... Could God not have overpowered Jacob? Of course he could. Did he want to overpower Jacob? Now that would be the question. What we seem to be reading here is a God who actually also seemed to desire to be in this wrestle at the same time. So we have Jacob here asking to be blessed, to which the response is a change of name. Israel, you have struggled with humans and God and overcame. How many of you growing up, way back, if you said that you struggled with God, would have been shot? Oh, come on. Honestly, if those words came out of your mouth, "I'm struggling with God," be like, "Child, where's your faith?" Wouldn't it? And yet here we have, right at the beginning in Genesis, at the 32nd chapter, which we're not even very far in, we've got a man wrestling with God, for crying out loud, saying, and God saying, "I'm going to bless you because you've struggled with God." Whole different concept than what I was taught. So what makes this change of name so significant? In Jewish times, a name revealed a person's identity. So God was revealing the name of his chosen people, that they would possess the same willingness and the same struggle with God and with humans. So think, from that point on, Israel and the Israelites were named as in his chosen people was about struggling and wrestling with God. Again, something that we haven't really grasped. So Jacob, who did everything in his life to feel secure through position and possession, ends up in a wilderness, in the dark, alone, and afraid. He's spent his life wrestling with man, now he wrestles with God. But he's blessed with a whole new identity because of this very willingness. However, there was the hip part, which we're going to look in the conclusion at the end. So you can see now we've gone from certainty-seeking faith to reading a story that talks about everything that is dark and unsure, and we've got this wrestle between man and God himself. Any of you sometimes feel like you wrestle? If you don't, you need to. And I'm going to get onto that in a sec. Now, we have another guy called Job. Anybody read Job? It's a trek, isn't it? I was always told growing up not to read it, including Ecclesiastes, by the way. Job and Ecclesiastes and Revelation, those 3 books. They were the absolute no-nos of Scripture. It's like, it's depressing, and it just gets you down, and there's no real kind of help in there. I would probably say that some of the most, well, bar Revelation, we'll leave that one on the side. Job and Ecclesiastes are some of the most real writings in the whole of Scripture. Now, Job is a good man, he's a faithful man, and he's faithful towards God in every way. However, here's the story. Satan turns up in heaven, and he says to God, I'm going to pose you a question. The only reason why Job serves you, loves you, and commits to you in the way that he does is because when you look at everything he has, it's all okay. He has certainty. He's got livestock. His family are okay, blah, 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 blah. I can guarantee you take away that certainty and he will not serve you or have faithfulness towards you. So basically, we start this process. Now, don't let this freak you out. I'll get to the conclusion in the end. It can sometimes be kind of like, oh my word, what's going on here? So Satan challenges God that basically people only serve him because they get what they need and what they want. So we start this string of horrific events. Listen to this. His servants are killed and oxen stolen. Following day, more servants are killed and his sheep are stolen. Following day, more servants are killed and his camels are stolen. Then number 4, are you ready for this? A mighty wind blew down the house that his sons and daughters were partying in, and the roof fell on their head and they were killed. That's quite intense, that, isn't it? Listen to his reply. If you can put the next, here we go. The Lord gives and the Lord hath taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. You're allowed to laugh, it's okay. The Lord gives and the Lord hath taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. Does that seem to you like a very righteous response? Some would say yes, some would say no. Let me tell you something. Some of the things that sometimes come out of our mouth, we might think are faithful and righteous, but they make God's skin squirm. Here's why. How many of you believe, did you know that this saying is the most quoted scripture at funerals? You agree, yeah? I can't imagine how that makes God feel. Seriously, it actually makes me quite angry. The Lord gives and the Lord hath taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. So do you agree then that an infant's funeral, the Lord gives and the Lord hath taken away, we are pinning that this God of love and this God of kindness, we're also saying that is a God that can zap people's family members away from them. I do not agree with that at all. So sometimes a response that might seem, well, this is definitely the right way to respond to this because, we've got to trust that God understands everything that's going on, etc., can sometimes be totally covered with falsity. Because is it really what we believe? Is it really what we believe? Following on from that, he then gets covered in boils. Bless his little heart. It's not going well, is it? But listen to what he says now. Not so pretty as the one before. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? Now, that word trouble actually in the original is evil. So Job is now actually starting to equate evil coming from God. So we're starting to see a little bit more raw talk coming from him now. As Job's trouble increases, he begins to speak much more honestly about how he feels, which at this point, people would say, you can clearly see Job's lost his faith. Wouldn't we? Somebody starts to say, oh, this is evil, God's sending evil. We'd be like, well, they must have lost their faith. This is not good, this is not good. You need to go back to the one before. The Lord has given and the Lord hath taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. Listen to what Job says. All was well with me, but he shattered me. He seized me by the neck and crushed me. He has made me his target, his archers surround me. Without pity, he pierces my kidneys and spills my gall onto the ground. If I got up and started with that tonight, you'd be like, oh my word, he's lost it. Somebody help him. Listen to the next one. I cry out to you, God, but you do not answer. I stand up, but you merely look at me. You turn on me ruthlessly. With the might of your hand, you attack me. You snatch me up and drive me before the wind. You toss me about in the storm. It's quite firm language, isn't it? And he's talking to God when he's saying that. Now listen to this. Job spends 39 chapters telling God what he thinks of him. It's the longest book in the Bible. 39 chapters later, Job's finally finished. Go read it, seriously. It's a real good read. And what I've just read there is really what it's like. We have a guy who's seriously wanting to argue his case now. I know some of you are probably thinking, oh, this is awful, you know. No, this is what's here, yeah? Now, meanwhile, while all this is going on, there's Job's friends on the sideline. Now, this is where it gets real fun. They believe that God is just and everything that goes on, you know, it must be all planned and preordained. Therefore, they assume that Job must deserve the suffering that he's under. Shocking, right? Now, why do they believe that? Let me say this first, actually, before I move on to that. Don't we come to all sorts of judgments when circumstances surround people? Don't we? We believe that certain circumstances must mean that a person isn't in the right place within their life and in their relationship with God. And actually, first of all, it's not our right to even question it. But second of all, we've totally missed the point of what this is about. All of a sudden, the situation that Job finds himself in becomes threatening to his friends because they realize that if all of a sudden there's no answer to this struggle and suffering that Job is under, does that mean that they could possibly also find themselves in a similar position? But they want to believe that no, it must be that Job isn't actually the man of faith that we thought in the first place, because he wouldn't be facing this if he really had the right amount of faith. So here you've got his friends, totally self-righteous and proud, believing that, oh, well, we're okay because our faith is just tip-top, fine and dandy. They don't want messy church, do they? They want it tidy. No chaos. Now, one of the things I wanted to add in at this point is, isn't it sad that when someone's facing stuff, that's often the time that friends should be the most loyal and the most faithful, not trying to figure out necessarily what their opinion is of it, but just being kind. Just being kind. Now, often it can be the other way, that friends get so scared by what's going on that they decide to walk away instead. And this can happen to all of us. Let me challenge you tonight, people. If you see someone struggling, don't judge the situation untoward because of how we've been brought up to believe things. Be a friend. Be a friend and just be kind, because sometimes that literally is the way of bringing forth freedom to that person's life. Let that be a challenge to all of us. As I think all of us can also be like Job's friends, can't we? We can get freaked out. God finally shows up in chapter 39. He's been silent from the first part of the book, where basically he's decided to kind of set this process in motion. Listen to what he says. Why do you confuse the issue? Why do you talk without knowing what you're talking about? Pull yourself together, Job. Up on your feet. Stand tall. I have some questions for you, and I want some straight answers. Thinking, he wants questions from Job? What is going on? This is ridiculous. Mad. So he says, pull yourself together. I want some straight answers. Now, for the next however many chapters, 2 or 3, God basically lists all the intricacies of everything that goes on in the cosmos. How only he knows how it all functions, how it all works. And who are we to think that we can ever grasp what is going on behind the scenes? Because it's just too amazing and too huge for us to get. Who watched Doubt the other week on the Wednesday? Did you see the film? How many of you were absolutely out of your head that there was no answer at the end? You all said it on the Wednesday, didn't you? The fact that there was no kind of resolution. Now get this. God doesn't let Job in on the secret why everything's happening how it is. Doesn't tell him. All he says is, basically, do you know what it's like to basically split the waters from the land? Do you know this? But he says nothing about the situation that Job finds himself in. Now, that's a real challenge to all of us because, again, there was no certainty. There was no answers. Sometimes we can find ourselves in our life desperately seeking answers, and sometimes you're not going to get them. You're probably finding this hard to hear, but this is truth, and there is a positive end. Now, God does say this. He lets Job know that we are misguided if we blame God, as Job did, but also misguided if we blame people, as Job's friends did. So you can see it's a double-sided thing when stuff happens. It's never an issue of blame. Never an issue of blame. Have you read the story where it's a blind man who sinned, this man or his parents? But then it goes on to say, it happened that the glory of God might be revealed. I'm telling you tonight, some of you need to remember that the situation that you find yourself in, the glory of God will be revealed. We try and control the situation by getting out too soon, when sometimes the process, I believe this situation with Nonnie, the glory of God is going to be revealed in that situation, in your family and in her life. I believe it. Whenever we are talking blame, we blame God, why has this happened to me? Blame people, why has this happened to me? We're missing the point entirely. Do you feel that Job deserved an explanation? You might do. I kind of think he did. There's many things about this story that I struggle with, but that's okay. But listen to Job's reply now, and I love this. I'm convinced you can do anything and everything. Nothing and no one can upset your plans. You asked, listen, who is muddying the water? Ignorantly confusing the issue, second-guessing my purposes. I admit it, I was the one. I babbled on about things far beyond me, made small talk about wonders way over my head. Now that sounds more real, doesn't it? Doesn't that sound fab? He's basically admitting that he babbled on about things far beyond him, made small talk about wonders that were way over his head. Let's move on to the next bit then. We got the next slide? There we go. And so it was, after the Lord had spoken these words to Job, that the Lord said to Eliphaz and Temanite, who were his friends, listen to this now, my wrath is aroused against you and your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Now, am I missing something here? Because did God just not reveal himself to Job and tell him basically, how dare you talk of things that you do not understand? Is that not right? But yet, in the next breath, God's just said, my wrath is aroused against you, the friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, like my servant Job has. So what does that mean? So what does this word right mean then? Listen to this. The Hebrew word for right is kun, K-U-W-N. Here's what it means, straight. Doesn't mean right, it means straight. So let me read it again. Another development of that is to be straight, straightforward, or honest. So let me reword this scripture. My wrath is aroused against you and your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is straightforward and honest, as my servant Job has. Makes you think, doesn't it? So both Job and his friends spoke of what they believed, but ultimately God's heart was towards Job because of his willingness to say exactly how he felt in the given moment. Now, some of you struggle with that because some would say, no, we should never be like that, when actually God is saying, he's spoken of me what is right, he's been straightforward and he's been honest. Job wrestled through this situation and proved himself faithful in the face of uncertainty. Now, if God is anything like the church has presented him to be, i.e., the more faith you have, basically the more certainty you'll get and the more that God will give you, we're actually, do I dare say this? We're actually siding with the devil's viewpoint. Because the first part of this story was the devil saying, the only reason people serve you is because you give them everything that they want. Now, if we actually go with that, we're saying that the enemy is correct. Now, the enemy is a liar. And God actually proved that he was a liar by the end of this story, showing that in spite of all that Job went through, he still remained faithful to who God was. We don't praise circumstantially. We praise because we trust who God is. We can get to the stage where everything is circumstantial on the basis of what we receive, rather than praising just because of the goodness of God. Is this all making sense? And that's the first time I've said that to you tonight. Do we know why people suffer? No, we don't. We don't know why some people don't suffer. You can never answer these questions. Never. But are we willing in it all to have that same Israelite faith as Jacob and as Job? Are we willing to wrestle through what we feel? Are we willing to be straightforward and honest and actually really take God to the mat about what we feel? Is there anything wrong with that? Listen to what Gregory Boyd says, an author. It's not a faith centered on right beliefs and pious language, and certainly not a faith that focuses on feeling secure by convincing ourselves that we are right. It's rather a faith grounded in authenticity that is unwilling to sweep questions, doubts, and complaints under a self-righteous rug to avoid the pain of discord. Isn't that awesome? How many of us try and sweep it under the rug to keep peace? We do, don't we, all the time? And yet he's saying, no, a faith is where we can come forward and we can express these emotions freely. Now, the end of Job's story works out that he actually prays for his friends, which I just think is such a lovely thing. He prays for his friends. God releases his friends of all of the stuff where they kind of went astray. And ultimately, he ends up getting back twofold everything that he lost. Now, is that the point of the story? I don't think it is. Now, some of you would think, oh, that's wonderful. Look, he got back twofold. But you see, we're doing it again. It becomes about what we get rather than the experience that Job had and what it taught him. We all need to be careful that it's more about the experience that we learn in our situations rather than ultimately what we gain from it. So in my conclusion then, and I really hope this has made some sense to you and I hope it's helped you understand a little bit more about faith. Going back to the story of Jacob, his wrestle gave him a limp. Just as Job's wrestle, to some degree, gave him a limp. Now, we say that he got twofold back. He lost his family and all that he had. We can't just say because he got twofold back, then he was not going to remember all the stuff that he had before. I mean, that's a massive pain to carry, when something like that has happened. So what is our assessment of a person with a limp? Some would say the rock isn't as bold and as confident as it used to be. Because maybe we're not as certain anymore. Everything is no longer clear-cut and maybe beautifully packaged like it was before. But it's now raw, it's honest, and incredibly real. It's a community with a limp. Do we all agree with that? A community with a limp, who have wrestled with people and wrestled with God and been willing to do that. You can't stride confidently with a limp unless you realize that the limp isn't a problem. See, even that in itself is an argument. You see somebody with a limp even talking about in these terms, well, it must be a bad thing. When actually it's a good thing because the very limp itself proves that your name's been changed. Doesn't it? You're no longer a grabber who grabs things to make sure everything makes you feel okay. Instead, you're someone who basically says, right, I'm not okay, I'm going to wrestle with God, and ultimately, I'm not going to let go until you bless me. That's what I want my life to be. And I know God's okay with that. And how fantastic we have a God who is. It's amazing. Job remained faithful in the face of uncertainty. Let me read this. Is it wrong to cherish times of certainty? No. If these moments come, they are a gift. But it is never right to use faith as a manipulative tool to make ourselves feel certain. We must, at the same time, be honest to confess the times we also feel totally unsure and insecure. Asking questions like, why do I believe what I believe? There's nothing wrong with that. Doubt isn't a problem that needs to be overcome. It's an invitation to a wrestle that needs to take place. Doubt is not the enemy of faith, but a friend of true faith. Are we confident that Jesus is the revelation of God in the earth? Yes, we are. But making this commitment does not mean we have to close the door on this or anything else. True faith is therefore being ruthlessly honest with myself and with God and remaining open at all times. Does that summarize it for you? Does that make sense? So guys, if things aren't happening the way you want them to, it's got nothing to do with your level of faith. It's just stuff. Sometimes it's nasty stuff that we don't like. You know, I wish we could get rid of it all, but we can't. This is the situation. And sometimes we speak of things that we don't understand. So what are we going to do? We speak openly and honestly, but then we surrender and say, God, bless me. Change my name. Let me have an Israelite faith. I'm willing to walk with a limp. I'm going to wrestle this out until I understand more of who you are. One of the greatest wrestles that a person can have is that God's love is infinitely greater than their sin. I believe that that's one of the greatest wrestles that exists today. You could get rid of sickness. You could get rid of all of that stuff. And yet ultimately, unless people are aware of that extravagant love that's placed in their lives, we're going to be no better off anyway. I believe that ultimately love is at the core, the thing that we've got to grasp in all of this. Let me tell you then what we can be certain of to finish this off. You ready for this? And I've read this before, so I am repeating myself, but I think it's fab. You ready for this? By faith, a righteousness has been revealed from first to last. Because of Christ, the wrath of God has been satisfied. Jesus' victory on the cross has trumped my ability to fail with no exceptions. My sins and unrighteous acts are remembered no more. God is not waiting for me to clean up, shape up, or get up. Everything is already finished in my favor. We are now invited to live a new life without guilt, shame, blame, or anxiety. The good news of Christ has confronted our version of our story with his version of our story. The gaze of God receives us just as we are, without judgment, distortion, subtraction, or addition. And last but not least, your deepest, darkest sins and your shameful secrets are simply irrelevant when it comes to the counterintuitive, ecstatic announcement that his grace is sufficient and nothing or nobody shall ever separate us from the love of Christ, full stop. And there you have it. Now, I understand that what I've brought tonight might have been heavy for some of you. And I actually met with Jenny Byrne this week to read it to her, and she called me today and she's like, I've been really thinking about what was said. And at first I was worried when I was reading it through text. I thought, yeah, when we're talking about issues of faith and people are struggling and people want answers to a lot of things, to some degree, what I brought to you tonight is a help and a hindrance at the same time. So I've told you we can't always have what we want. But at the same time, I'm giving you the keys to say you're okay to wrestle. Tell God what you think. It's okay, he can handle it. You might come out with a limp, but that's a good thing. So I hope that those last points, you can be sure of those. You can be sure. And I think as long as we get centered in them, we're going to be right, aren't we? So I hope that's helped you tonight. I hope you feel inspired. If you've got any questions, please come and see one of us guys, me, Chris, Danny. We've also got pillars in the back, so please go and enjoy some food, and we will see you not on Wednesday. Not on Wednesday. We'll see you next Sunday for the Easter special, which is going to be awesome. So love you all. Take care.